Most families guard secrets. But what if your very existence was one? Hidden deep in the hills near Yard, the Whittaker family lived for decades in near total isolation. No steady medical care, limited education, minimal outside contact. A cluster of homes and dirt paths that felt less like a neighborhood and more like a sealed pocket of time. And then a photographer drove in. His name was Mark Laita. He wasn't chasing clicks. He wasn't building a YouTube brand. In 2004, he was documenting Americans living on the margins, the unseen, the overlooked, the forgotten. What he found would become one of the most haunting and debated portraits of generational isolation ever filmed. These are 9 shocking truths Mark Laita has shared about the Whittakers, truths that challenge comfort, blur ethical lines, and force us to confront what we'd rather not see. Truth number 1. He was warned not to go, and went anyway. When Mark asked locals about unusual families in the area, one name kept surfacing in whispers: the Whittakers. The warnings came just as quickly. Don't go alone. Don't show up uninvited. And be careful. Isolation breeds rumor. In small communities, stories travel quietly. Some residents felt protective. Others felt embarrassed. But nearly all agreed on one thing: the Whittakers were different. When Mark arrived, he didn't encounter aggression. He encountered something stranger. Stares. Nervous laughter. A man pacing and vocalizing in sounds rather than words. That man was Timmy. Timmy did not communicate through conventional speech. He barked, grunted, repeated patterns. But Mark has said that despite the sounds, there was awareness in his eyes. Curiosity. Recognition. Mark took photographs and left. But the images stayed with him for years. Truth number 2. He kept the photos hidden for 16 years. That first encounter in 2004 did not immediately become public. Mark has explained that something about the situation felt unfinished. Sensitive. Heavy. He locked the images away. It wasn't until 2020, 16 years later, that he returned with a video camera. Why? Because he felt the story was bigger than shock value. He believed the Whittakers represented something America avoids confronting: extreme rural poverty led with generational inbreeding, limited education, and systemic neglect. When the first video went live, it exploded. Millions of views, thousands of comments, sympathy and disgust colliding in the same thread. But what the world saw in 2020 was only a fraction of what Mark had observed across 2 decades. Truth number 3. The family tree wasn't a tree. It was a loop. Mark has said he never intended to conduct a genealogical investigation. But over time, patterns emerged. 2 twin brothers married 2 sisters. Their children were genetically closer than typical cousins. Those children later formed relationships within the same extended circle. There were no official public records neatly mapping the lineage. Much of the family history was oral, fragmented, inconsistent, sometimes guarded. But one thing was clear: isolation compounded over generations. In communities where transportation, education, and economic opportunity are scarce, social circles shrink. When outside interaction is limited, marriages and relationships often occur within proximity. Over time, proximity becomes pattern. Timmy is widely believed to be one of the most visibly affected by this legacy. His developmental challenges are pronounced, but it's important to approach this carefully. Inbreeding increases genetic risk, but it does not define humanity. Mark has repeatedly emphasized that while the biological reality is startling, the deeper shock lies in how long the situation went unaddressed. No intervention, no structured oversight, no consistent healthcare access. For decades. Truth number 4. Access was not easy and not always safe. When Mark returned in 2020, gaining trust took persistence. Some neighbors remembered him from 2004. Tension surfaced. At least one confrontation involved a local man approaching with a firearm, demanding he leave the area. No shouting, no debate, just a warning. Mark left immediately. He has described the environment as volatile, not necessarily because of the Whittakers themselves, but because outside attention disrupts fragile ecosystems. Even within the household, filming raised ethical questions. Some family members did not want to be recorded. Others lacked clear capacity to consent in conventional terms. Mark has acknowledged the discomfort of documenting people who may not fully grasp global exposure. That tension sits at the center of every debate about his work. Truth number 5. The GoFundMe changed everything and ignited backlash. After the video went viral, viewers asked how to help. Mark launched a fundraising campaign. Within weeks, tens of thousands of dollars poured in. The funds were used to secure improved housing, plumbing, beds, appliances, basic comforts the family had never consistently had. But success triggered suspicion. Was he profiting? Did the family know how much had been raised? Was consent informed? Was visibility exploitation? Mark responded publicly with updates, receipts, and explanations. He stated that he worked directly with caretakers and ensured funds went toward tangible improvements. Still, critics remained. Some believed the story should never have been told. Others believed telling it forced long overdue support. The debate hasn't ended, because at its core, it's not just about the Whittakers. It's about where documentation becomes intrusion. And that line is never perfectly clear. Those are the first 5 truths. But the deeper ones, the ones that shook Mark personally, are still ahead. Truth number 6. Odd. West Virginia didn't ask for the spotlight. When the Whittaker videos went viral, the internet treated it like discovery. But for the people living near Odd, it felt like exposure. Small Appalachian communities survive on privacy. Reputation matters. Outsiders coming in with cameras rarely ends well. And overnight, Odd became shorthand online for inbreeding, isolation, and mockery. Some locals were angry at Mark Laita. They believed he hadn't just documented a family, he had branded a town. Even residents unrelated to the Whittakers felt judged. Their home was suddenly trending in comment sections filled with ridicule and shock emojis. For them, the viral fame didn't feel like awareness. It felt like humiliation. But not everyone reacted with anger. Some saw the videos differently. They saw generational poverty. They saw a lack of access to healthcare. They saw what happens when rural communities are left without investment, education, or support. To them, the Whittakers were not an embarrassment. They were evidence. And that split, savior versus intruder, followed Mark every time he returned. He has said in interviews that he spent as much time explaining his intentions as he did filming. He talked to neighbors. He answered questions. He reassured people that the goal wasn't spectacle. But intentions don't erase impact. Once millions of people associate your town with a viral narrative, the association lingers. Truth number 7. Exposure changed the family in ways the camera couldn't always show. When donations came in, practical changes followed. A proper home, working plumbing, beds instead of makeshift sleeping arrangements, heat, appliances, basic dignity. Those improvements were real. But psychological change is harder to capture. Mark has noted that after exposure, some family members became more guarded. Strangers began driving by. Some showed up uninvited. Others shouted insults from vehicles. Fame in isolation does not feel glamorous. It feels invasive. Timmy, however, showed subtle shifts. Mark observed increased eye contact, moments of engagement, small responses that suggested stimulation from new routines. Not dramatic transformations, not viral-ready moments, but incremental human change. That detail often gets lost. The internet gravitates toward extremes, before and after, tragedy and triumph. But the Whittaker's evolution was uneven, grateful, yet overwhelmed, helped, yet scrutinized, improved, yet still vulnerable. And vulnerability increases with visibility. Because once you are known, you cannot become unknown again. Truth number 8. The ethical line never stopped moving. From the beginning, critics questioned whether filming the Whittakers was inherently exploitative. Did they fully understand what global exposure meant? Could they consent in the way society expects? Was poverty being monetized? Mark has addressed these questions directly. He has said repeatedly that he approached the family with respect, returned funds to them, and avoided sensational framing. He has emphasized that he did not script them, did not manipulate them, and did not exaggerate conditions. But ethical discomfort does not disappear just because intentions are clear. Documentary work involving vulnerable individuals lives in a gray area. On one hand, exposure brought tangible improvement. On the other, it exposed them to ridicule and unwanted attention. Both truths coexist, and that's what makes the story so complicated. Mark has admitted that over time, he felt less like an observer and more like a participant. When you fundraise, coordinate housing, manage donations, you are no longer just holding a camera. You are influencing outcomes. He became, in his own words, invested. Not in the clicks, in the people. That shift carries weight. Because once you step beyond documentation into assistance, your responsibility changes. You are no longer capturing reality. You are shaping it. Truth number 9. The moment that shook Mark wasn't what viewers expected. Among all the shocking visuals, the isolation, the genealogical complexity, the developmental disabilities, Mark has said the most impactful moment wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Off camera, he once asked an older member of the family if they understood why people were watching them. The response was simple. Because we're different. No anger, no shame, no confusion, just recognition. That answer stayed with him, because it reframed everything. The Whittakers weren't performing. They weren't trying to shock anyone. They weren't even asking to be understood. They were living. And being different, in a society obsessed with normalcy, was enough to make them spectacle. That realization unsettled him more than any genetic detail, because it revealed something about the audience. We are drawn to what feels foreign. We stay, we comment, we debate, but rarely do we examine why. The Whittakers became a mirror, not just reflecting generational inbreeding, but reflecting how quickly society categorizes other. And once categorized, how difficult it is to see humanity beyond the label. Mark has described the family as the most real people I've ever met. No filters, no pretense, no curated persona. In a digital era dominated by performance, their authenticity was raw and disarming. But authenticity is also fragile. And once the world watches, authenticity becomes content. That tension never fully resolves. By the time millions knew their names, Mark had known them for nearly 2 decades. What began as a photographic curiosity turned into a long-term relationship. He has continued to visit, not always with a camera rolling, because after enough years, the story isn't just about exposure. It's about responsibility, and that responsibility extends beyond funding and filming. It extends to understanding what visibility costs. The 9 shocking truths aren't shocking because they are grotesque. They are shocking because they reveal systemic neglect, ethical ambiguity, community division, and the fragile line between awareness and intrusion. But the story isn't finished. If the first chapter of the Whittaker story was discovery, and the second was exposure, the third became something far more complicated. Intervention. After the viral surge connected to Mark Laita, money flowed in. Housing improved. Utilities stabilized. The visible poverty that once defined the family began to shift. But visibility does something else. It invites scrutiny. When millions watch a vulnerable household, agencies begin watching too. Not because cameras are illegal, not because poverty is criminal, but because vulnerability combined with money triggers review. And this is where the story changed again. Protective services began evaluating conditions more closely. Questions surfaced about safety, supervision, and financial oversight. Allegations circulated online about exploitation, not necessarily from Mark himself, but from individuals who later entered the Whittaker orbit. Suddenly, what began as documentation turned into something larger. Oversight. One of the most difficult truths in stories like this is that outside help can destabilize fragile ecosystems. Before exposure, the Whittakers lived in isolation. After exposure, they lived under observation. And observation alters behavior. Donations meant new visitors. Visitors meant new influence. Influence meant tension. The home that once felt frozen in time now had outside voices directing change. Some family members embraced it. Others retreated. Timmy, whose developmental challenges were among the most visible, experienced increased stimulation. Mark noted moments of engagement, eye contact, subtle responsiveness that suggested growth. But growth does not erase complexity. As the years progressed, conflicts emerged. Who controlled the money? Who spoke for the family? Who decided what improvements were made? Who determined what was filmed? The internet debated these questions relentlessly. But behind the scenes, something quieter was happening. State systems were paying attention. When vulnerable adults are publicly documented receiving large donations, agencies often evaluate whether benefits are properly reported, whether guardianship is appropriate, and whether exploitation risks exist. It's not accusation, it's procedure. And procedure does not care about viral narratives. By 2025, reports surfaced that adult protective services had stepped in more formally. 3 members of the Whittaker household were removed from the property and under protective authority. Betty remained. Larry remained. But Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine were relocated. The internet erupted. Some blamed outsiders. Some blamed the state. Some blamed the family. Some blamed Mark. But protective removal does not happen because of YouTube comments. It happens because agencies determine that safety thresholds require intervention. What triggered that threshold remains confidential. Protective cases involving vulnerable adults are sealed by design, which means the public never receives a full report. And silence breeds speculation. Was it financial mismanagement? Was it external exploitation? Was it internal neglect? Was it a combination? There is no publicly released document detailing every factor, only the result: removal. This is where the ethical debate intensified. Should the story have been told at all? If exposure accelerated scrutiny, did it help or harm? There is no simple answer, because exposure did bring improvements. Better housing, better infrastructure, greater visibility to systemic poverty. But it also introduced chaos. The Whittakers were no longer just a family. They were a case, a headline, a debate, a symbol, and symbols rarely live peacefully. For Mark, this shift was personal. He has spoken about feeling protective of the family, not just as subjects, but as people he had known for nearly 20 years. When controversy swirled, he defended transparency. When accusations arose, he released documentation. When conditions improved, he continued support. But once the state becomes involved at a formal level, control shifts away from documentarians. Protective agencies do not consult YouTube channels. They follow statute, and statute prioritizes safety over sentiment. This marked the 4th transformation of the Whittaker story. discovery, exposure, intervention, containment. Containment looks like silence. No updates. No location disclosures. No confirmation of visits. The family that once lived in isolation became hypervisible. Now they exist under confidentiality. For viewers, that feels like disappearance. For agencies, it feels like protection. One of the hardest truths to accept is that once a case becomes formalized, public access ends. The story continues. But not for us. Mark's role changed again during this phase. He was no longer simply documenting poverty. He was navigating legal caution. When exploitation allegations surfaced involving other individuals connected to the Whittaker orbit, the environment tightened further. Access protocols became stricter. Communication became guarded. Updates became rare. The narrative that once unfolded in front of millions retreated behind institutional walls. And this is where the shock deepens. Because the most dramatic changes were not filmed. They happened in court filings, in agency meetings, in confidential evaluations, not on camera. The Whittakers had once represented generational isolation. Now they represented the collision between viral visibility and protective bureaucracy. Which raises a question few are comfortable asking. When does help become exposure? And when does exposure become risk? Mark never intended to create a spectacle. He intended to document reality. But reality is not static. It reacts to attention. And once attention crosses into intervention, the ecosystem shifts permanently. The Whittakers are still in West Virginia, still part of the Appalachian landscape. Still human beings navigating lives shaped by circumstances beyond their control. But the era of open access appears to have closed. When the first Whittaker video went viral, sympathy moved faster than suspicion. But suspicion always catches up. After fundraising campaigns generated tens of thousands of dollars, the questions started arriving in waves. How much was raised? Who controlled it? Was it reported properly? Did the family understand the scope of what had happened? At the center of those questions stood Mark Laita. Mark had built a reputation long before the Whittakers through his broader portrait work. His project documenting marginalized Americans was not new, but the Whittaker videos amplified his reach to an entirely different scale. And scale changes scrutiny. When money enters a vulnerable household, accountability becomes part of the conversation whether anyone wants it to or not. Mark launched a GoFundMe after viewers asked how they could help. He stated publicly that all proceeds would go toward improving the Whittakers' living conditions. Updates followed. A new house, plumbing, beds, appliances, repairs. Receipts were shared. Progress was filmed. The family appeared inside improved conditions. But online commentary did not calm. Some viewers claimed exploitation. Others accused him of profiting from tragedy. Some demanded itemized audits beyond what had already been shown. There were two parallel reactions happening at once. One group saw measurable improvement. Another saw vulnerability being monetized. Both responses were emotionally charged. The core ethical dilemma sat in the middle. Is it possible to document suffering, raise money to alleviate it, and remain completely free from exploitation claims? For many critics, the answer was no. They argued that filming individuals with severe developmental disabilities, particularly those unable to articulate full consent, crossed a moral boundary. Supporters countered that the visibility led to tangible change that would never have occurred otherwise. The debate grew louder, and then a second wave of controversy emerged, not centered directly on Mark, but on others who entered the Whittaker orbit after the viral explosion. New visitors appeared. New intermediaries claimed involvement. New narratives about financial control began circulating. Allegations surfaced that certain individuals around the family may have mishandled funds or used proximity for personal gain. The internet blurred lines. Was the issue Mark? Was it others? Was it the family? Was it the system? In public controversies, nuance rarely survives. Mark responded repeatedly. He emphasized transparency. He reiterated that he had no legal guardianship authority. He explained that funds were directed toward housing improvements, not personal enrichment. He continued visiting the family, documenting progress cautiously. But once public doubt attaches to a story, it lingers. Reputation becomes part of the narrative. Another layer complicated matters further. When vulnerable adults receive government benefits, such as disability assistance, outside donations can trigger reporting obligations. If funds are structured incorrectly or not reported appropriately, agencies may investigate. That does not automatically imply wrongdoing, but it does mean paperwork matters. Online observers began speculating about whether large donations could affect benefit eligibility. Others suggested government review might follow viral exposure. By 2025, state protective intervention occurred, as previously discussed. 3 members of the Whittaker household were removed under Adult Protective Services Authority from their home near Odd. That removal intensified everything. Suddenly, the earlier financial debates felt prophetic to critics. They argued that exposure invited intervention, that money created chaos, that the family's quiet isolation had been disrupted irreversibly. Supporters responded differently. They argued that systemic poverty had existed for generations and that scrutiny was inevitable once attention arrived. 2 truths can coexist. Exposure can improve conditions. Exposure can also destabilize them. And Mark found himself standing between those truths. He was no longer simply the photographer who returned after 16 years. He was perceived, fairly or unfairly, as a central figure in a chain of events that altered a family's trajectory permanently. That perception carries weight. Mark has spoken about the emotional toll of the controversy. The internet reduces complex relationships into headlines. But over nearly 2 decades, he had built familiarity with the family. He knew their rhythms, their humor, their vulnerabilities. To critics, it was content. To him, it was relationship. The backlash also revealed something broader about digital culture. When audiences encounter extreme poverty or unusual circumstances, initial reaction often splits into 2 camps. Rescue or reject. Some want to save. Others want to condemn. Rarely does anyone pause to examine structural causes. Rural Appalachian poverty did not begin with a YouTube video. Limited access to healthcare did not originate with a GoFundMe. Generational inbreeding patterns, while shocking, are often rooted in isolation and lack of mobility rather than malice. But structural analysis doesn't trend. Conflict does. As debates intensified, Mark continued to document cautiously. He reduced sensational framing. He emphasized humanity over shock. He clarified repeatedly that the Whittakers were not caricatures but individuals navigating circumstances beyond their choosing. Yet one question would not disappear. Should the story have been told? There is no clean answer. If it had not been told, the Whittakers would likely still be living in severely compromised conditions. If it had not been told, Odd, West Virginia would not have faced unwanted national attention. If it had not been told, the ethical debate about documenting vulnerable communities might have remained abstract rather than concrete. But telling it altered everything. Visibility is irreversible. The backlash forced a broader cultural reckoning. What do viewers owe subjects? What do documentarians owe participants? Where does help end and harm begin? Mark never claimed perfection. He claimed intention. And intention, while important, does not shield anyone from criticism. The Whittaker story became more than a portrait of inbreeding. It became a case study in modern ethics. Poverty meets algorithm. Isolation meets monetization. Humanity meets spectacle. And in that collision, no one remains untouched. By the time controversy reached its peak, the Whittakers were no longer just subjects of a documentary. They were part of a national conversation about exploitation, agency, and dignity. What do we actually see when we look at the Whittakers? And why does it unsettle us so deeply? By the time most people heard the name Whittaker, the story had already passed through multiple filters. Shock, sympathy, outrage, debate. But beneath all of that, one question lingers. What do we actually see when we look at them? When Mark Laita first walked into the hills near Odd, he didn't describe monsters. He described people. Real, unfiltered, unrehearsed. The internet often framed the Whittakers as a spectacle, the most inbred family in America. That label spread faster than context ever could. But labels are shortcuts. They compress complexity into something digestible. And once a label sticks, it becomes harder to see the person underneath it. The ninth and final truth is not about genealogy, not about controversy, not about money. It's about reflection. The Whittakers unsettled viewers not only because of visible genetic consequences, but because they expose something uncomfortable about modern America. Isolation still exists. Extreme poverty still exists. Communities can still fall through cracks so wide they become invisible. For decades, the Whittakers lived largely unseen, not because they were hiding, but because no one was looking. And when someone finally did look, when Mark returned with a camera, the reaction revealed more about the audience than the subjects. Some people mocked, some pitied, some donated, some accused. Very few paused. The family did not choose generational isolation. They did not design a closed social circle. They did not build the structural neglect around them. They were born into it, and they endured it. Mark has said that what struck him most wasn't dysfunction, it was resilience. The laughter, the closeness, the small moments of connection that survived despite everything. Those details rarely headline a viral clip, but they are there. Over nearly 20 years of interaction, Mark's role shifted from observer to participant to, in some ways, advocate. Not because he set out to become one, but because once you witness that level of marginalization, neutrality becomes difficult. The backlash, the ethical debates, the accusations, they are all part of a larger cultural tension. We want awareness, but we resist discomfort. We want truth, but we recoil from what it shows us. The Whittakers forced a confrontation, not just with inbreeding, not just with poverty, with the idea that entire families can exist in silence while the rest of the country debates policy and prosperity. And here is the final, unsettling layer. If Mark had never gone back in 2020, if the videos had never been released, if the donations had never flowed, most of us would still not know they existed. Their lives would have continued quietly in the hills. No outrage, no improvement, no controversy, no national conversation, just invisibility. So what is more disturbing? That the story was told, or that it took so long for anyone to notice? The Whittakers are not just a family frozen in a viral narrative. They are a reminder that poverty does not disappear because we ignore it, that generational cycles deepen when communities lack resources, that visibility is powerful, but never simple. The story isn't over. It never really is. Because once you've seen the Whittakers, you can't entirely unsee what they represent. Not spectacle, not shock, but a question. Who else is living unseen? If this story made you think, say so. If it challenged you, reflect on it. Leave your perspective in the comments. What do you see when you look at the Whittakers? Sometimes the most powerful truths aren't the ones that scream. They're the ones that force us to sit quietly and reconsider what we thought we understood. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.